This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
In this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, I have back Brian Silliman. Brian is a partner at Hughes Hubbard and heads the firm's Harris office. We take up a couple of articles that Brian has recently authored. In this episode, I visit with Quyen Truong. She is a former member of the CFPB, and she talks about the CFPB under the Biden administration, and Rohit Chopra, who has been nominated to head the CFPB. We talk about what it will take to rebuild the morale of the CFPB after the Trump administration, the direction the CFPB may take in regulation and enforcement, any new policies and directives she sees coming out, and the interaction between the CFPB and the individual state consumer protection agencies. It's a fascinating podcast on a topic that every compliance practitioner needs to be aware of. FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with another episode. And today I have back with me Quyen Truong. She is a partner at Stroock Stroock. And we are going to pontificate, look into the future, and then always talk about the CFPB. So, Quyen, first of all, welcome back, and thank you for taking the time to visit with me again.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be back. The CFPB certainly is a hot topic these days, once again.
Not only is it appropriate, but it's certainly a welcome from my perspective. I was wondering if you have obviously a lot of experience with the CFPB, having worked there, but could you give us a sort of a recap of what the agency is, what it regulates, and what it does?
Sure. So the CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was created in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And the concept is to concentrate in one federal agency all of the work to protect consumers in regards to financial products and services. So before the creation of the CFPB, that responsibility was scattered, and the implementation, enforcement of the various consumer financial protection laws were divided among several different agencies. But the CFPB now hold all of those rulemaking, supervision, enforcement responsibilities for consumer financial products and services. And of course, that runs the gamut, from mortgages to student loans, small dollar loans, and so forth. And it really covers every stage of that relationship from the time that the companies develop and market their financial products and services all the way through the whole relationship in terms of originating loans, servicing them, and for debt collection, and for something like mortgages, in the foreclosure stage as well. And the CFPB has authority over every player in that market. So, it doesn't really matter whether they are well-established banks, for example, or new entrants or service providers and vendors that work with those companies.
President Biden has nominated Rohit Chopra to head the Bureau. I was wondering if you might be able to give us some insight into what, if he's confirmed, what the likely impact will be for the CFPB.
So I do know Rohit very well. We worked together in the senior leadership of the CFPB back when we were both in that organization, starting from the start of the Bureau, really. And he is very focused and dedicated to a very active agency in terms of using all of its tools to advance the mission to deal with consumer financial protection. So we will see a return to a lot of the regulatory priorities and strategies that were employed by the CFPB under the Obama administration, if Rohit Chopra is confirmed as a permanent director of the agency. And, I have every expectation that he will be confirmed in the near future.
I'm having a series of conversations with people like yourself about the impact of the change in administration in various agencies, departments, and bureaus. And it's really boiled down to two questions. What do they do to reassure the public of the Bureau's desire to move forward? But equally importantly, how do you rebuild, or how would he go about rebuilding the morale inside the agency after the prior administration?
That's a really good question. And I know it's something that people think about because obviously over the past few years under the Trump administration, for the CFPB in particular, there was a major change in the alignment of the Bureau, its activities, particularly with the two heads of the agency that were appointed by President Trump. And first of all, you had as acting director of the CFPB, Mick Mulvaney, who had always been a huge critic of the agency. In fact, opposed the creation of the agency to begin with, and certainly its continued operation as well. So that obviously was a very dramatic and some might say traumatic change in leadership for the agency that occurred a few years ago. And then after that, as permanent director, we saw Kathy Kreninger, who took a less vocal, aggressive approach to changing the direction of the CFPB than Mick Mulvaney, but still followed a very different philosophy from the early days of the Bureau. And you had a workforce at the agency that had remained largely intact from the early days of the Bureau's creation. And so these were people who came in with a focus on regulatory activism that was not shared by the new leadership. And by the way, the acting director and permanent director over the last few years also brought in a lot of their own people, political appointees in large, who shared their philosophy as well. So it's been an interesting period for the agency staff to work through where there was such a significant shift. But as I mentioned, the staff has stayed largely intact. And then now you have essentially the return of old leaders from the inception of the Bureau. So there's a very rapid change back, even under the acting director, Dave Wejo, who had worked at the CFPB from its inception. And he's been very aggressive in realigning the Bureau's direction to those early days as well. So the staff already has experienced that shift and can look forward to a continuation of that going forward. And so I think it actually is easier to address the issue of staff morale as a result of that, because the staff has a lot more certainty as to what they can expect going into the future with these familiar faces back in leadership, and the sense that they are moving back toward something that is closer to the original direction of the CFPB when they first joined. Now, obviously, there are also various members of the staff who have come in over the last few years who have not had the experience of working under these individuals and under this regulatory approach. But I think that they have enough of a sense of how that will go that it shouldn't be a jarring adjustment for anybody within the Bureau.
For our listeners, this is the second time that I've been able to visit with Quyen, and it's clear to me in now having visited with you twice for this podcast series, you have quite a lot of pride in your time there and proud of the Bureau and what it accomplished. First of all, I hope that's a fair assessment. But second, from your answering the last question, it seems that your colleagues who are still there also feel that way, and that might lead to really make it a little bit easier for the CFPB to become more aggressive and while being aggressive on the regulatory side, also work with people like yourself, private practice companies to move forward the ball or the goal of consumer protection. Sorry.
Well, I think, I've had the privilege of working inside the government at various agencies, have always found the experience to be very rewarding. And I think, this is not to say that the pride that I and others have in the work that we did at the CFPB and at other federal agencies during our time there is an indicator that those who work at those agencies and the work that they perform have not been very important contributors to the government and to the public as well. So I think that there has been good work done also in the last few years, that there are differences of opinion about how things can or should be done. But it is always, to me, a source of pride for people to get to work in federal agencies and state agencies and other governmental units as well, when you always have people who are very dedicated to trying to serve the public interest. If they weren't, they wouldn't be there. And so I do think that there is that strong spirit at the CFPB now. And I think that the shift toward regulatory activism is going to be very enthusiastically supported by the team that's there. And of course, the CFPB now is also gearing up with a really big hiring drive to bring in additional attorneys in particular, among other staff, in order to really beef up their capability to carry this work forward in a much more active way.
Are there any policy initiatives or new directives that you might anticipate from the CFPB in the next 12 months?
Oh, there's a lot that's going to be at work at the CFPB in the next year, I think, and really going forward as well. And we're already seeing that at the CFPB now, even before the confirmation, the expected confirmation of Rohit Chopra as the permanent director, that there's already been a great deal of activity and a lot of pronouncements too coming out of the CFPB as to their interest in being very active in this space. So, it's interesting to me in particular how a lot of the same issues that drove the creation of the CFPB and its agenda during the early years really have come around again. And that's because the impact of the financial crisis in many ways were similar to the impact of the pandemic on the general population, and in particular on some of the more vulnerable populations that are most needful of regulatory protection from the government, and in particular from the CFPB in the eyes of many people. So, for example, with the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, of course, the big focus was on mortgages. That a lot of people had taken out mortgages which they were unable to pay off, and there were a lot of concerns about how that all came about and what the government could do to address that problem. And that, in fact, was a driving force for the creation of the CFPB. Well, today we have the pandemic creating so much financial hardship for everyone, but in particular, it raises a lot of issues around housing insecurity for a vast swath of the population. And there are problems with people's ability to pay their mortgages. And of course, you have the CARES Act and other federal and state efforts to address that problem with forbearance plans so that people have a certain period of relief from having to make those payments. But the implementation of those mandated and voluntary forbearance programs have been challenging. And, a lot of those programs are coming to an end in the near future if they aren't already terminating. So there are a lot of concerns about that in terms of the impact on consumers and how they'll deal with it. So, that's one of the big pieces, I think, in terms of the CFPB's agenda for this next year going forward, is dealing with issues surrounding mortgages. And just generally the impact of the pandemic on consumers. Again, mortgages top that list, but it's really the whole range of financial hardship issues for consumers, and of course how the industry, the financial industry, has interacted with consumers in their provision of financial products and services. And in particular, there are a lot of issues around servicing of the loans that people are struggling to pay off. And then the resultant debt collection activities, the potential for foreclosure or repossessions of vehicles and other things. So all of those issues related to the pandemic will be very prominent in the CFPB's work for this next year. And then I mentioned mortgages as being high on the list, but you also have all of the other financial products and services as well. And on a related note, whenever people struggle with paying off their debts, there are also issues about how that would get reported to the credit reporting agencies. So, it affects your credit score. And the whole credit reporting process is a very complicated one as well. And it's been complicated even further by the pandemic because you have circumstances that are fairly novel. And, you also have these forbearance programs raising new questions as to how they should be handled in the credit reporting process as well. And by the way, in terms of consumer complaints that the CFPB and other authorities have received, a very large portion of the consumer complaints have dealt with credit reporting and disputes about that. So I think credit reporting also will be a major focus for the CFPB for this coming year as well. And then, this past year, of course, has really raised awareness of concerns about systemic racism, and just inequities in general, and the concerns about vulnerable populations. And of course, the Biden administration has identified racial equity and just equality in general as a major concern. And both the CFPB's acting director, Dave Huecho, and the nominee for permanent director, Rohit Chopra, have also emphasized their concerns about racial equity and how the CFPB's work would be important in dealing with those issues. So, that's also another major focus for the CFPB, not just for this coming year, but also going forward. So the big issues about fair lending.
I was wondering if you might be able to give us a few words about the interplay between the CFPB and state attorney generals or state regulatory agencies that might also look at consumer protection.
Oh, yes, that whole federal-state relationship is really, really important in the financial space, in particular in the realm of consumer financial protection. And the states in general are pretty active and focus on issues of consumer financial protection. And again, all of these issues have been highlighted by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the general public, and in particular on some vulnerable populations as well. And then together with that, you had the fact that the last few years under the Trump administration has seen a lot of conflict between the federal authorities and state authorities because of fundamental differences in opinion between them. And in fact, the states many times, not every state, but a number of the states, both the attorney general and the regulatory agency at the state level have been vocal in their criticism of the activities or the rollback in activities or activism by some of the federal authorities under the Trump administration. And sometimes those conflicts have resulted in the states bringing action in court to challenge the federal authorities' activities. So that has been, a big issue of the last few years. And so I think that's an important question to raise about what's going to happen going forward. It's particularly pertinent with regards to the CFPB because the CFPB has been the target of a lot of state criticism over the last few years. And that stands in sharp contrast to the nature of the relationship between the CFPB and the states in the past. During the period of the Obama administration and the kind of holdover period when Rich Cordray remained director of the CFPB under the Trump administration during the early part of the Trump administration. So it's useful to think back to those early days where the CFPB and the states actually worked together pretty closely, in part because you had a number of, in fact, a pretty large number of people coming from the state government side to the CFPB when it was created. And, those were folks who had worked in the state attorney general office. And of course, Rich Cordray himself had been a state attorney general. And so you had people coming in from those state attorney general offices, from the state regulatory agencies, to join the CFPB, and they maintained their relationships with their state colleagues And the states actually welcomed the creation of the CFPB because many of them found that there was a common regulatory approach as well as pretty similar regulatory priorities between them. So there was a lot of collaboration and discussion around that. And it was something that allowed for some coordinated action, sometimes divisions of labor between the federal and state sides. And in fact, after the change in leadership at the CFPB, in terms of departures from the agency during the Trump administration, you also saw a number of people departing the CFPB to join or rejoin the state attorney general offices and regulatory agencies. So again, you had that sort of cross-pollination effect. What it ultimately means is today, with the shift back to regulatory activism at the CFPB, there is a lot of expectation of collaboration once again with the state authorities. And it's something that the state authorities have been looking forward to when they realized that there would be this change in administration, and then soon after that, the understanding that you have a lot of the same leadership return to the CFPB as well. And I suspect that with the hiring drive that the CFPB is undertaking now, again, with a particular focus on hiring attorneys as well as other staff to beef up its workforce, that we will see some folks coming again from the state attorney general offices and state regulatory agencies into the CFPB. So, that whole relationship will continue to strengthen going forward.
Well, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if listeners wanted any more information on yourself or any of the topics you've raised in today's podcast, where could they go?
So, one place that's always a very ready source for information is the website of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau itself, which is consumerfinance.gov. It's fairly straightforward. So, when you are interested in learning more about what the CFPB is doing or learning about particular aspects of its regulatory activities, the CFPB website is a really great resource. And of course, I'm always happy to discuss this subject, which is near and near to my heart, and something that I work on a day-to-day basis. So, as you mentioned, I am a partner at the Stroock Law Firm. And so you can come to our website to find my information and contact me. And Stroock, the law firm's name is spelled S as in Sam, T as in Thomas, ROOCK. So at the Stroock.com website, you can look up our practice dealing with the CFPB in particular. And of course, my name is Quyen Truong. That's Truong, T as in Thomas, RUONG. And happy to address additional questions as well.
Well, Quyen, I hope that I might be able to call upon you in 6 or 12 months to see the developments in the CFPB and what you're seeing from your perspective. So I look forward to continuing the conversation.
I look forward to that as well.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Foxaville. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. We have a great new show on the Compliance Podcast Network called Mo Forecast, which is podcast of the law firm of Morrison & Forster, hosted by James Koukios. Check that out on the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, in the month of April on The Compliance Life, I'm featuring Jonathan Kellerman, partner at Stone Turn. He's got a fascinating career in healthcare compliance, culminating in the CCO chair at Allergan before he moved over to Stone Turn. So check out The Compliance Life on the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of the award-winning FCPA Compliance Report.